All right, Susan, you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, cool. All right, everyone, thank you for joining us in this week's episode. We have Susan Franzen. She's an OD practitioner, and she specializes in connecting the dots between change management and neuroscience. She helps organizations align structure and mindsets and behaviors to better drive business performance. So, Susan, thank you so much for being here. We're glad to have you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So, Susan, we typically start off the conversation by just learning more about your background. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I've always been really fascinated in what motivates people to do what they want to do. And my dad said, get a business degree. You can always fall back on that. So I did that, and then was going to go get an MBA and thought, gosh, I don't know that business is really where I want to be. So it took me several years, but then I found the Neuroscience of Leadership program. And that just appealed to me because it was different, and it really brought together everything that I was excited about. So I got my master's in that, actually graduated in 2016. So it did take me a long time. But have had my own business, done consulting, worked for the University of Texas for the past 11 years in various roles, actually applying these techniques. And now I'm getting ready to launch a new consulting business with some colleagues to do this all over again. So very exciting time.
Awesome. So having studied neuroscience and then, being exposed to, management consulting and advising organizations, how did you connect the dots? Like, how did you, what made you really leverage neuroscience to do this work?
Well, neuroscience is a basis for everything that we do, for how we think, how we behave, what we believe. And so by studying that and by reading about all of the current research on it, you can really start to see how it plays out in the environment. You can see how people's self-limiting beliefs actually stop them. And the science behind why it stops them from achieving what they want to achieve. You can see why we naturally gravitate towards collaboration. You can see why we naturally resist change. So everything we do is really based in the cognitive neuroscience, which also brings in the psychology and the sociology.
Yeah. And then we were kind of talking about this before the official webcast started, but we're in 2019. Why are we seeing and hearing so much more about neuroscience and why now?
Well, I think that's a great question. To me, it's about the advanced pace with which they're learning about the brain. A few years ago, President Obama had promoted the Brain Initiative. It's really about how do we understand the brain so we can solve and hopefully eradicate diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's, and so we can really understand mental health issues. So there's a lot of research that's going on with those broader themes. But then if you extrapolate that out into the work environment and to leadership, you're also looking at it in terms of the legal industry. So if we find out something about the brain that says, people really don't have a free will, they don't have self-control, how does that impact how we prosecute for crimes? Does that then eradicate all of the people who have been sentenced for crimes? You look at philanthropy, what causes people to give, be engaged in their community. And so how do you activate those things if you're really looking to get somebody involved in their community and engagement for students, for patients? It just has such far-reaching implications. And I think the faster we're learning about how the brain works, the more it's getting out into the mainstream.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Now, connecting the dots between neuroscience and change management within organizations, right? I think there's two levels to it. There's resistance at the employee level, maybe the individual level, and then we can talk about how do you take learnings from neuroscience and try to reshape, organizational culture or drive new leadership practices. So looking at the individual, why do people resist change?
So I think it's actually biological. So our bodies are designed to maintain a a steady state, which we call homeostasis. And so if you start working out and your heart rate rises, then that activates sweat. So that is the body's attempt to cool down. If you're uncomfortable, your body tries to regulate its temperature. It tries to make sure that, if you haven't eaten, it lets you know that you're hungry and you go eat. So the body is really about, how do I maintain the most comfortable, steady state possible? And when we have status quo, we have steady state. When we start to integrate changes into the work environment or our personal lives, that creates dissonance. It's a discomfort that we feel in our bodies because of the change. And so we do anything we can to return to that steady state. That's why you hear people say things like, I can't wait for everything to get back to normal. Or, once I get through this, my life will be normal again. So we want to normalize our lives, and change disrupts that. There's a lot of uncertainty, and it's very uncomfortable. So we work really hard to try and resist any of those changes in order to keep that steady state. The second piece of that is survival. So if you think back to, the evolution of humankind, survival was all about having security and certainty in your environment. And so if you saw something that you'd never recognized before, the brain automatically goes, that's a threat. And until you realize that it's not a threat, it's a very uncomfortable position. So you survived because you resisted change. But the brain also has a desire for a certain level of newness to keep life interesting. So you just have to find that right balance.
Awesome. So how does nudge theory fit into this?
So nudge theory is one of my favorite brain hacks, and you can use it on yourself. If you use it on others, I just caution you to be, ethical in how you use it. But we prefer to make choices, and we like to make our own choices. So what nudge theory does is it helps you to architect choices that are good for you, but gives you the perception that you're making the choice. So, for example, you might see an advertisement that shows an apple or a cheeseburger, right? The cheeseburger picture might have somebody with a really big belly, and the apple might show somebody with a really flat belly. So that's nudge theory at work in advertising to try and get you to make the healthier choices. The supersize for fast food it works to get people to eat more, but research has shown that it also, if you downsize, you have the option to downsize, it helps people to reduce the amount of food that they take in. One of my favorite stories about nudge theory was I was watching a friend's grandson, and I walked in the door. He was struggling to get the grandson to go for a walk, and they were just arguing, and the little boy was resisting because he didn't want somebody telling him what to do. So I said, let me try something. And I walked over to him and I said, would you want to go for a walk or ride your bike? He said, ride my bike. I said, okay, do you want to go for a short walk or a long walk? Short walk. Okay. So then every time we got to an intersection, I'd say, do you want to go right, left, or straight? So he was driving that, but he was ultimately doing something that was healthy for him as opposed to sitting in the house watching TV. And we were just giving him choices that he wasn't resisting because he felt like he was driving the direction that he was going. So when you think about change management, how you're really trying to get people to behave in a different way. And so how do you give them choices along the way to reduce that natural resistance and to get their buy-in and engagement much sooner?
Awesome. No, thank you for connecting that and making it make sense for us. In terms of effective forecasting, this was one of the concepts that you talked about in a previous webcast. Can you tell us about that and how it relates to change management?
Sure. Effective forecasting is kind of like weather forecasting. We think we know that we're good at it, but we're really not, because if you look at weathermen are probably right about 10% of the time. So we we struggle to be effective in determining how we will feel about something in the future. We really only understand how we feel about things today. And so if you've ever booked a flight at 6 a.m. and the night before thought, gosh, what was I thinking at the time? At the time you booked it, you probably had a lot of logic, like, well, I'll get there early, I'll have the whole day.
Mm-hmm.
But as you're running around that night before packing and thinking of all the things you have to do before, and then you've got to get up at 4 to make that flight, sort of what you thought was going to be a big benefit for you when you booked the flight is not what you view as the big benefit, which might be extra sleep or extra time with your family or time to finish that report before you get on the plane. So we, when we integrate that into change management, what that allows us to do is to set a time in the future when the change will occur. So that gives people time to transition into that new reality. And as change managers, it also gives us an opportunity to hear what are the concerns, the fears, the challenges that people are experiencing or that they're envisioning with the change, so that when you actually do make the change, you can address all of those things in advance, and you can redesign the launch of your change based on what that feedback is. So it's a really powerful tool. It's also a powerful tool to get people excited about something that doesn't have to happen for a few years. So you'll see a lot of legislation that gets passed, like the Obamacare and other things where people voted today, but it didn't happen for a year or two out, and it wouldn't fully materialize for several years because people today wanted it. And then, as the time goes on, they may not want it as much, but they've already committed to it, so they're going to see it through.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Let's transition into pilots. Right now, if you're a mid-size or even a large company, you're probably managing and implementing 50 to 250 projects a year, which is a lot. They're going through a lot of change. And so a lot of companies are trying to follow agile ways of working. And so they pilot a lot of things before they kind of go full scale. What are your thoughts on that? We talked before, you have a contrarian view towards pilots. Can you share that with the audience?
Thanks. I do have a contrarian view because most pilots are not scalable. So if you look at the research of how many pilots that were successful pilots actually scaled and became generalizable to the population within an organization or community, it's very small. And that's because it's sort of like studying something in a laboratory and then releasing it to the world. You set certain constraints in a pilot program and people behave in certain ways, but you're also getting people to participate in a pilot who most likely are going to already like the change that's going to happen. And you think about what resources you need for the small group versus what resources you need for the larger group. So a few years ago, I started experimenting with what I call at-scale pilots. So these are pilots that we use effective forecasting to plan out. It might not start for 3 or 6 months. And then we design it using nudge theory, where people might have options on when they start to interact with the change. It might be how they interact with the change. Do they want something, do they want their communications via text or email or video, or, so we give them options along the way. And then we have a set date when the pilot ends. So basically, once you've launched the pilot and then you're coming back and you're evaluating the outcomes, by the time we got to the end date, I would say on the majority of our pilots, we had already adopted that as the new norm. All of people's fears at the beginning of the pilot didn't come to fruition. They didn't materialize. So we were able to quickly adopt those changes and move forward even earlier than what the projected pilot end date was. Now, that doesn't work for everything. I recognize that there are some high risk, very expensive types of changes that you need to implement, and you can't do that. But I would encourage people to look at where can I integrate more at scale, because it allows everybody to be going through it at the same time, which also builds a solidarity, and people say, okay, we've weathered that. We can definitely weather this next stage of the change.
Yeah. So with organizations changing a lot a lot faster than previous years, and then with this point of view that you have around pilots, are there any other hacks that a change manager can leverage to get their people or leadership to think about forward change, right? Because like today, everyone's so accustomed to the change is happening, and we're trying to create plans for resistance. But how do we start to move mindsets towards people being enthusiastic about the change?
Well, and that's the part that most change models don't really talk about. So if you look at Cotter's change model, you look at Bridges' transitions, you look at the ADKAR model, they all talk about this desire, build these coalitions of people that are already moving forward, and how to, and that you have to generate desire, but nobody really tells you how to generate desire. And so the brain hacks like nudge and effective forecasting work. There's something called the no returns policy, which is based on research on purchasing, that people who bought something that they couldn't return ended up happier with it than things that could return. So
really?
I integrate that. Yeah. And
wow.
So I integrate that into my pilot program too, that, we'll have the pilot go for a period of time. And then once we decide to adopt it, then there's no going back. And people get to that point, and once there's no going back, they go, wow, this really wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. There's also some really fascinating research on minority population in terms of the leverage point for change. So you really only need 10% of your population to buy into the change. And what this research showed was that if I believe something about the change and you don't, when you and I have a conversation, you're either going to decide that I'm right and move forward with the change, or you're going to go back and get research and ultimately move forward with the change. So they didn't find that after you and I had a conversation about it, that there was resistance, because just having that one-on-one conversation allows you to think differently about the change. And that's why I usually tell people change happens by invitation. So it's me having a conversation with you. Getting everybody in a room is great, but that's just about the awareness piece. The desire happens one conversation at a time.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Given all of the advice and guidance you gave around neuroscience, what's your advice for someone who's listening to this conversation and they want to take these neuroscience hacks and embed them in the organization? Like, how would they go about doing it? How would they go about influencing leadership to think differently?
That's a great question. And, I can explain how we did it, and what worked in our environment was, I did a lot of research about each of the hacks so that I understood them really fully. And then I took some smaller changes and I experimented with it and said, okay, what if we used effective forecasting by itself? What if we used nudge by itself? What if we combine them in this way? So I think some of it is trial and error to see what works in your environment, because I can speak to what works in my environment. And as I start working with other environments, and I really work with about 15 different environments across the state of Texas. So each of those is a little bit different. I would also say that you want to address up front the ethical issues around things like nudge theory. So you don't want to come across as manipulating people into doing things. How we managed that was we educated people on what nudge theory was. We told them that over the course of a few years' time, we were going to be implementing some change programs that were going to use nudge theory. And if at any time someone became uncomfortable with it, they could reach out to us. And so, I think one of the things that worked well for us with our executive leadership was that we could promise outcomes. So we could say, we can make this particular change more successful because look at all of the smaller changes that we've done over time, and those we use to educate people on how to change. So then when we got to the bigger changes, people were more receptive. They trusted the fact that we were doing what was right for them and the organization. And they knew that we were going to be working with them to bypass their natural resistance. And so, we were building resilience and capability for change through those processes.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's awesome. Susan, we reached the end of this webcast. What's the one thing that you want people to walk away with?
I would say that if you forget about all of the tactical aspects of change management and you focus on the desire and the engagement piece, you will be more successful than you could ever imagine in terms of getting people through the change with the least amount of pain as possible.
Okay, awesome. I just got a message from Wendy, so let's see if we can transition her in. Wendy, let's see, where are you? There you are. Let's see. Wendy, can you hear us?
I can. Thanks.
Hi, Wendy.
Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's really interesting. And I had a question about the notion of giving people choices during the change process. I liked how you gave the example of the little boy and asking him, do you want to do this or do you want to do that? Can you give us a real specific example of how you might use this in the workplace around change to give people choices?
Sure. So one of our most recent projects was an office consolidation of 7 offices across the city, and we were consolidating into one building, and we were going from 70% office space to 30% office space and more of a modified open floor plan concept. And so people had a lot of concern about that, the privacy, all of the noise, all of those challenges. And so what we did was we built a prototype. So we asked one department to work in that prototype space for the 2 years it was going to take to build the building. And we had 2 open houses. So the first open house was we brought everybody in, and there were little sheets on each workstation that said, what do you like about this? What don't you like about this? Do you like, which of these 3 different heights of workstations did you prefer? Which style of office configuration would you prefer? So we got all of that feedback. And then we had a second open house where we had actually modified that prototype space with their comments. So then we came back and we said, okay, now this is what you asked for. How does this look to you? So do is this the right height, or would you like a lower workstation? Do you want this color chair or this color wall? So we just identified the specific things that people had choices over, and we allowed that to be implemented and designed into our change. Another change that we did was eliminating the need for exempt staff to do timesheets. And we got initially a lot of resistance from leaders who said, well, how am I going to know whether or not my staff are actually working the hours we're supposed to work? And so we gave them options. We said, okay, we can do an authorization that each person has to authorize that they're going to respond truthfully, so then the accountability falls to the individual as opposed to the leader, and that could be done on a case-by-case basis. And what was really fascinating about that was that through that dialogue, because that pilot wasn't starting for another 2 months, we were able to identify what were the choices that the managers wanted and what were the choices that the staff wanted. And then we built that into the pilot. So by the time we got into the pilot, we had actually changed the software to where you didn't have to do an authorization. You just had to click that you had no exceptions to report, and that served as your authorization that you had truthfully acknowledged your time. And so that was one of the pilots that we cut short. We continued to track the outcomes, and for the next year, we compared the reporting against our baseline, and we were able to show that reporting accuracy actually improved through that process as opposed to the previous year.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. Yeah, no, thanks, Wendy, for your question. Really appreciate it. So this concludes our webcast. Susan, thank you so much for giving us all this information around neuroscience and really connecting the dots. It's a conversation that we need to continue to push forward. So thank you so much for your time. For those of you who are also on the call, thank you for taking time to join us today.